Welcome back to Public Affairs on Peach. I'm Sharon Reed. CBS 46 was given unprecedented access into the Douglas County juvenile court system to see what happens when kids break the rules. We're back with Judge Peggy Walker. Thanks so much, Judge. You're in that courtroom every day. Before the break, I was asking you about the kids. How young are they, and what kind of questions are they asking you now that they are able to participate in the process?
I actually have jurisdiction over children from the time they're born, so some of the children will come to me and have an initial hearing when they're discharged from the hospital. So they may be infants, and I may actually hold them on the bench, because it's really important for me to be able to see if there are any issues that are readily identifiable. You know, when a child is born with opiates in their system, they're going to be rigid and they're not going to have the same reaction that a normal child has when they're born. So I have jurisdiction from infancy all the way to the age of 18.
Before the Governor Nathan Deal signed the reforms into legislation, what was it like in your courtroom?
Well, there was a lot of debate about what was the role of the child, whether the child should be present, to what extent the child should participate. So typically it was more common for me to see the child at the point where I was actually doing reviews instead of at the beginning of the case. So I wanted the children present for reviews. I did not want anything in Georgia to happen like in Florida. There was a child where no one laid eyes on that child for 2 years. No one knew what happened to that child. So I made it clear that I was going to see a child minimally every year, and I would like to see them more often. I can tell a lot by their behaviors. I can tell a lot by their reaction to the people they're with, the people who come into the courtroom who may be their parents or may be other family members. I can see how they relate to their siblings, and I can tell a great deal just from the way they talk to me how well they're doing in our system. So it's important to have that opportunity to see the child, to hear the child, and to have that child's input into their case.
You mentioned opioids, you know, a child, an infant born with drugs in their system, but what about violence? How often does violence bring kids in front of you?
Well, that is probably the top three. We deal a great deal with substance abuse, mental illness, but domestic violence is without a doubt one of the major causes for children entering into our system. It's very hard to address domestic violence. It's the family secret, and until you build trust and until you build relationships, that child may not tell you they've witnessed that violence. And certainly the parents are not going to disclose and discuss that. Family violence is very often kept secret.
What about your role as a judge? I mean, having been on the bench all of these years, and you tell by the way you talk that this is really a labor of love. You love children, that's obvious. But how did your role specifically change on the bench after the reforms?
Well, I had to be a lot more cognizant of where the children were, how what we were doing was affecting them. It really came home to me when we took a break in doing a probable cause hearing. We were having a case that was particularly painful because the child was alleging inappropriate touching by her father, and at some point in the testimony she just said, "This has to stop." And I explained to her that we needed to complete the evidence. She didn't have to stay in the courtroom, but we did need to complete the evidence for me to make a determination. And I knew it was uncomfortable for her, so it was fine for her to leave the courtroom. But what I didn't understand was during the lunch break when she said it needed to stop, I didn't pay attention to the words. I wasn't really clear in understanding what was going on, and she actually took an overdose of pills during the lunch break.
Oh, wow.
So that made it clear to me that we were going to have to put a lot more time and a lot more effort and a lot more thought in how we were handling our children in the courtroom, and now we do it with much more care and consideration.
You know, there's a lot of people out there who don't think that Lady Justice is metered out fairly. Race can play a role. Talk to us about these young offenders and the racial makeup coming before you.
Well, we live in a very diverse county, and what we see is more attention focused on children of color. So we have to be very careful about issues around bias. The good thing about the work that Georgia has done is we've done a detention assessment instrument, and the whole purpose of doing that is trying to filter out those implicit biases, because we don't want overrepresentation of children, particularly children who are in detention. We don't want overrepresentation of children who are in foster care. So we need to work very hard on cultural competency and make the right decisions for that child and make sure that we are being very thoughtful about the cultural implications for that child.
So is there training for people in your position on the court, but also the caseworkers too?
There is a wonderful training for judges. I cannot tell you the impact that it has for you to go through some of the poverty simulations so that you understand how some of the decisions our parents make. If you don't have enough money to renew your driver's license and pay for some antibiotics your child desperately needs, you're going to pay for the antibiotics. You're going to let the license lapse.
I want to talk more about the poverty simulation that you talked about, but we'll do it after the break when we come back much more with Judge Walker.